Good afternoon, guys. Welcome to the presentation on Mr. Gerkins, InnerSource's first open source tool. So before I go ahead with the presentation, let me introduce myself. I'm a software development engineer at Amazon. I work for the buyer experience team for Amazon Pay. Until recently, I was a software engineer at PayPal. That's where I developed Mr. Gerkins, and that's also where I was part of a team that adopted InnerSource. So over here I'll be talking about my experiences with InnerSource at PayPal. So how many of you actually work on open source code base, like code that's out there and anybody can access it? Oh, that's pretty cool. And how many of you work in companies that don't let you open source the code, but you can access it within the company? Any team can access it. That's pretty good. And how many of you have taken the courage to contribute to a code base that's not yours at all? I mean, that belongs to some other team. Oh, that's good. So, and the reason I put InnerSource in the middle and in the smallest possible font is because even at Amazon, for instance, the code is completely open source, but there are no inner source principles as such. They don't follow the inner source model, and that's what I found out that most companies kind of are in. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to an architecture like this, wherein you have let's say the components on the left side are all UI components, and the one outside the bottle are downstream core components, and you have certain middleware components at the middle, at the bottleneck. And if the UI needs to do something, needs to get some additional data, they have to go through the middleware, and it's always this bottleneck that causes slowdown in the program, because the team would be limited and they wouldn't have the capacity to take up all the work. And that's the kind of team I was working with at PayPal. It was called the payments platform, and this is a rough architecture. I mean, this is not the original architecture of PayPal, just a reference. So you have a lot of UI components, you have an API facade, and they talk to the payments platform, and this layer kind of behaves like a data layer. So if any of the upstream component needs any additional data, they would just integrate with the payments platform. And the payments platform is an orchestration layer that would talk to additional services like user, merchant, funding options, risk, and other services to get that data and give it back to the maybe UI component. And then let's say a merchant is ready to actually move money. He wants money to move to his account. He would make an API call, and that's when payments platform would talk to transaction engine. As you can see, any work that needs, I mean, if there's a new product that PayPal has to launch, it would require some effort on the payments platform team. And you have a limited number of employees. You can't have infinite employees, right? So there was a time where all the teams were blocked on the payments platform team, and then that's where the program managers step in and they negotiate, they decide which project to prioritize and stuff. And and this is what drove my old team to adopt InnerSource. So InnerSource, I mean, so on paper, it basically means that now you have the entire company can contribute to your code base, and so now you have a larger workforce. And this also theoretically means that you have faster time to market. So somebody comes up with an idea, and let's say one of the UI components wants to render a new product, and for that now they don't need to rely on payments platform to make the changes. They can actually open up the repository, contribute to the code, and they would be unblocked, right? So which also means that the requesting team and the team that owns the component can continue focusing on their milestones, and they don't have to worry about blocking each other's way. And then the requesting team can take ownership of this code which they contribute to a foreign component. In this case, is completely their own. They can control it. And for the company, this is a huge bonus, because now you have developers who've become well versed with different components in the software stack and not just their own. But then this all looks good on paper, but when we started the inner source model, this is how our engineers were. we had to work extra, because now we had people contributing to our code base and then disappearing. Some would leave the company or move to a different team. Now we own this code, and we had absolutely no clue what it does. And now we had bugs because of the code, and we didn't know we didn't know how it works. There were no integration tests, and this is how our nights were. We had to like stay up night and find bugs and fix them, which is why we laid few ground rules. Now, I mean, even though the code is open, you have to follow our rules, right, to contribute to our code base. So first thing we did is we created a contributing.md file where we put a list of guidelines around the code quality, what kind of code quality we expect, all the design patterns we expect. Then we had huge guidelines around testing and automation. Then we had the standards for pull requests. So when somebody is working on a big story, we would want to be informed at least 2 sprints in advance that, hey, we would be getting a story and the code would be huge. So and then main thing here is defining an ownership period, right? So initially it was like the external team would contribute and disappear. Now we started putting in limits like you have to support us for 60 days. So any bugs comes up in the first 60 days, you have to own it. And so we also had a framework for handling bugs and monitoring. So having having guidelines for this certainly helped us a lot, but there were still overheads in the inner sourcing model, right? I found that a lot of developers were now spending time on documentation, right? Now you have teams from outside also contributing to a code. So now you need to have release notes, and then management wanted to know, hey, how are we doing with the inner source? How many pull requests are we getting? So we had to track down which all pull requests were inner sourced, and then a lot of time between developers was kind of, I would say, wasted in communication. So you would have an external team making a code change and then emailing different developers asking, hey, is my code in the repository yet? Is my code live yet? When will my code be going out live? And then you would have the manager of the same person communicating the same thing. So people are just communicating, and then also it is also important to track how many defects are coming through the inner source pull requests. So as they say, right, if there's anything that's mundane that a person doesn't want to do, you should try to automate it. And that's what I did with Mr. Gerkins. So Mr. Gerkins is a tool that I developed to automate these mundane inner source related tasks. So one of the main things it does, is it generates release notes. So it basically looks up all the pull requests that were merged since the last release, and then it creates a file in your repo and updates that file with this information each time you create a tag. Then let's say now when I'm going out to release my component, I would create a tag. At that time, all the contributors whose pull requests were merged would be notified saying that, hey, your following changes are going out live on such and such a day. And then once the changes are live, the contributors would be, and their managers and distribution and a certain distribution list would be notified that these changes went out live, and you can view the release notes here. And also what it does is, now let's say a particular team X owns a particular component and you are an outside contributor and you raise a pull request against it, that pull request automatically gets labeled inner sourced. So under the hood, Mr. Gerkins is built on Spring Boot. Java 8, and it relies on the webhooks issued by GitHub and Jenkins to automate these tasks. I mean, though I've put Jenkins Jenkins up here, it could be anything. It could be Circle CI or any other CI you use. And so now let me take you through the different use cases and how things work under the hood. So let's say you have let's call him Jim, and a developer from an outside team. He creates a pull request, and when he creates a pull request, GitHub, you can configure GitHub to send out webhook notifications. So GitHub sends a PR webhook to Mr. Gerkins, and Mr. Gerkins checks either a configuration file or it checks the email server to see if this person is a member of this team or the owning team of this repository. If not, that PR has to be labeled InnerSource. So Mr. Gerkins then invokes the update issues API and changes the label to InnerSource. And this is the flow of control for generating release notes and notifying tag cut. So this I've taken an example of a team using a Jenkins CI. So you have a developer from the team using the Maven release plugin to trigger his release, and so in Jenkins you can schedule certain steps that should occur before SCM download, basically before the source code is downloaded, after the source code is downloaded, before build is complete, and after build is complete. So basically here, so when the person triggers a Maven release plugin, Jenkins would call an API on Mr. Gerkins saying that, hey, I am about to build this component, and immediately Mr. Gerkins queries GitHub. It gets the latest tag, the tag that's on release right now, and then it finds all the commits that were merged after this particular release tag. So that would be the release tag versus head. And now if you closely look at GitHub, whenever a pull request gets merged, you would have a commit on the lines of merged pull request number X from persons / repository to full repository. So it basically uses that pattern to identify all the pull requests, and then it picks up those commits, picks up the title from that, and it updates the release notes based on that information, and then it commits it to GitHub using again a GitHub API to do that. And then meanwhile parallelly Jenkins would be building the component, and once the component build is complete, in the post HCM step you have to configure something wherein it would basically get similar to what it did in the first step, get a list of all the pull requests, get the contributors, and then group the pull request by the contributors and send an email out to all these contributors. So let's say you have 4 pull requests that have been merged since the last release. You would get a single email saying that your following 4 pull requests are a part of this tag. The other thing is now different companies have different ways of releasing, right? So that's something that's kind of sketchy, which you can't necessarily automate. But GitHub has something called drafting a new release. So in the previous step, before going out live, you would have cut a tag. GitHub provides you a way of making that tag as your release tag. That's a way of telling GitHub that this particular tag went out live. And so whenever you do that, when you draft a new release, again GitHub can be configured to send out a webhook, and that webhook comes to Mr. Gerkins, and Mr. Gerkins notifies the DL saying that, hey, this change, we had a release on such a such day, and these are the following changes that went out live, and it would give a link to the release notes. So now let's say if you liked my talk and you decide to go ahead and fork Gerkins, and you want to know how to actually deploy it for your company. This is the deployment and setup life cycle. So first step is basically to go to the PayPal open source GitHub page and download or clone Mr. Gerkins. and then you have the application.properties file. So this is where you should make your team specific changes, such as which all distribution list to notify, or if you don't want to use the DL model, you actually want to list out all the members of your team, and if you want to customize the email template and stuff, that's something that you need to do in step 2. Once you do this, you have to generate a executable jar file, and you can do that by doing a Maven clean package that would basically generate a executable jar for you. And once you have this jar, spin up a VM or something, and run this executable jar as a background process. And so now you would have a server and you would have a corresponding port number. So to keep this information handy, go to GitHub. So in GitHub, go to your repository, go to settings, and there you'll have a list of webhooks that you can configure. And over there you can choose if you want your PRs to be tagged InnerSource, so you can sign up for the pull request webhook, or if you are interested in the release part of it, you can sign up for the release webhooks notification, and then you can add the build steps on Jenkins or whatever CI you are using. And for more information, you can actually go to the Mr. Gerkins repo, go to the getting starting file, and you'll have step-by-step information. Now onwards to the future. So I haven't contributed to this repository in 4 months or something, but this is my vision for the future. So if anybody is interested in contributing, these are things I would like to see in Mr. Gerkins. One is integration with Slack. So one problem with email distribution lists is it's very tied to a company. Some companies use similar lists, some companies have their own implementation, but one thing that different companies would have in common is they use Slack or something similar to Slack. So I want a way in Mr. Gerkins wherein you can notify your contributors on Slack. So it should send out Slack messages to the contributors instead of emails, and then you should be able to trigger a Maven release through Slack itself rather than going to the Jenkins page and triggering it. And then update release details from Slack. And then another thing here is as I mentioned before, right now there are 2 ways of checking if a team member is from a particular team or not. One is by adding that to the configuration of Mr. Gerkins, or the other way is to integrate with your email distribution list, and if a person is a member of the distribution list, then he is a member of your team, else not. But if you have Slack, you can have a Slack channel. So you can use Slack APIs to determine whether a person is in your team or not. So that will be a good feature. And while I was working with the payments platform team, I used to have weekly meeting with Denise and Silona. And the thing they would ask me is metrics. They would ask me about how many pull requests were merged, which are InnerSource, how many lines of code were introduced, right? So the problem with GitHub is that it's not trivial to get information on how many lines were changed for a given period of time. You need to call the GitHub API, get the result, and you need to do some kind of arranging, which I never got time to do. So that'll be a very handy metric that will help everyone. And better DevOps. As you can see right now, it's basically you generate the executable and you deploy it, right? If you can Dockerize it, or if you can get it in a state that people can just deploy a Docker container and they have the project ready to go, that'll be awesome. And now if you're interested in forking the repository, you can go to github.com/PayPal/Mr. Gerkins. So I think we have about 6 minutes, so I'll open it up for questions. So any questions?
I sort of imagine Daniel having questions about that.
I would say it's easy to have code lines over the time, so you just need the tools.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of tools outside. So I don't know. Have you tried some of them, or do you have some tools for repositories?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah,
I didn't get.
are you using some tooling for mining your repositories?
Oh no, I mean nothing yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So probably we can talk later.
Sure.
Yes, in terms of open source, there are a bunch
Right.
of those.
Yeah. So I mean, this was plain using vanilla GitHub APIs and nothing spectacular. Yeah.
Yes, we should figure out a way of working.
Yeah, it'd be really nice if it
So
was
he's
easy for
doing
everybody to
more
use.
than us, but Mr. Gerkins.
So well, I would say that we have a 100% open source tool chain.
I see.
And one of the tools basically retrieve information from Git. So you can go for number of lines or files.
I
or
see.
Even understand what developers are working with, which developers in what modules or files or directories.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
It's Grimoire Lab, and the tool is Perceval, which is Perceval. But we can have some discussion later in the roundtable.
Any other questions?
Maybe just a non-technical question. Is there an interesting story behind the name, Mr. Gerkins?
Yeah, sure. So I was thinking about a name for the tool, and basically, if you look at what it does, is it basically integrates with GitHub. It integrates with Jenkins. I mean, at least that's what PayPal was using, which is why I used Jenkins and GitHub. And it was basically helping our team with the release process. So if you look at it closely, it's a play with GitHub, release, and Jenkins. Yeah.
Did you have fun writing it?
Yeah, I did.
It seemed like you did.
Yes.
It made you famous for a minute inside your company.
Right.
And gave you negotiating opportunities. I believe. I think we told
Yeah.
you it would do that.
Yeah, so it was a fun experience, and I mean, though I would have liked it if there are more contributors to it. So yeah, it's something that you can look it up. I mean, it's yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.